Hello everyone and welcome to Spill Secret. Before we start, we ask you subscribe and leave a comment as to where you are listening from. Let's begin. Alex didn't mind the night shift at Cutter's Market. It was quiet, and he enjoyed the solitude that came with working alone. There were the usual night owls and a few regulars who wandered in, but most of his shift was spent stocking shelves, checking inventory, and listening to the low hum of the fluorescent lights that buzzed over the aisles. Tonight, though, something felt different. As he clocked in and slipped on his apron, he couldn't shake the prickling feeling at the back of his neck, like someone was watching him. It started as a subtle unease, an instinct he couldn't explain. Cutter's was always chilly at night, but tonight the cold seemed to sink into his bones, clinging to him as he moved through the aisles. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the late hour and his imagination getting the best of him. But as he stocked the last few items in aisle 4, he thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye, a shadow slipping along the edge of the shelves. "Hello," he called out, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly would break the stillness. No one answered. He waited, listening to the hum of the lights, but there was nothing else, only the silence pressing in around him. Telling himself it was nothing, he returned to his work, though the sense of unease lingered, a quiet dread that settled over him like a fog. Around midnight, the store grew even quieter, the outside world slipping away into darkness. Alex was at the back, unloading a crate of canned goods, when he heard it, a faint tapping sound, echoing from the front of the store. He paused, listening, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "It's just the pipes or something," trying to ignore the nervous flutter in his chest. But as he walked back toward the front, he saw it, a row of cans he'd just stacked had been knocked over, each one rolling in a neat line across the floor. He frowned, glancing around. There was no one else in the store, he hadn't even heard the door chime. Kneeling down, he started gathering the cans, but as he did, he felt that same prickling sensation, like eyes boring into his back. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the aisle was empty. When he returned to the front counter, he noticed something odd. The security monitor's screen was flickering, static breaking across the image before settling back into view. And on the screen, just for a split second, he saw a figure, a dark silhouette standing in aisle 4, motionless. His pulse quickened as he looked up, his eyes scanning the aisles, but no one was there. Only the quiet, empty aisles staring back at him. Alex took a deep breath, trying to shake off the fear creeping up his spine. He told himself it was just a glitch, a trick of the light, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. There was a presence in Cutter's Market tonight, something lurking just out of sight, waiting. And as he continued his shift, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was watching him, waiting for him to let his guard down. The unsettling events only grew stranger as the night wore on. Around 1 a.m., Alex was wiping down the deli counter when the lights flickered, casting the store in momentary darkness before buzzing back to life. He glanced up at the ceiling, his heart pounding as the familiar hum of the lights returned. He was used to the occasional power hiccup, but tonight, each flicker felt like a warning, a reminder that something was lurking just beyond the glow. As he moved through the store, he became aware of subtle sounds, a faint rustling here, a soft creak there. He told himself it was just the building settling, but he knew Cutter's wasn't that old. The noises seemed deliberate, like whispers floating through the aisles, barely audible but persistent, tugging at his attention as he tried to finish his tasks. Every time he stopped to listen, the sounds would fade, leaving only the silence and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Around 1:30, He returned to the front of the store to check the security monitor. He leaned in, his eyes scanning the grainy footage, half expecting to see the shadowy figure again. But this time, there was something even stranger. A shopping cart in aisle 3 was slowly rolling forward, its wheels turning in smooth, deliberate circles as if pushed by invisible hands. Alex watched, frozen, as the cart moved a few feet before stopping on its own. A chill ran through him as he realized there was no one else in the store, no reason the cart should have moved on its own. He told himself it must be a draft, a slight tilt in the floor, anything to explain away the creeping dread that was gnawing at him. But the rationalizations felt thin, hollow. He knew, deep down, that Cutter's Market was holding its breath, watching him with an intensity he couldn't explain. Just as he was about to look away from the screen, he caught sight of something else, a flash of movement in the back room, a dark blur slipping past the camera's view. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening on the counter as he turned toward the back, every nerve in his body on edge. He knew he should leave, lock up the store, call it a night. But an inexplicable urge drew him toward the darkness, a need to uncover whatever secret the store was hiding. As he made his way to the back room, the air grew colder, the silence thicker. He flipped on the light, the fluorescent bulb flickering for a moment before settling into a steady glow. The room was empty, its shelves lined with boxes and crates, everything exactly as he'd left it. But as he moved further in, he noticed something strange, a single item left on the floor, out of place. It was a photograph, old and faded, showing the store as it had looked decades ago. There, in the picture, was the front of Cutter's Market, its sign freshly painted, the aisles bustling with life. But at the edge of the photo, partially hidden in shadow, stood a figure, a man dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured, watching the store with an intensity that sent a chill through Alex. And in that moment, he knew the figure wasn't just a relic from the past. It was something more, something that had been here long before him and would be here long after he was gone. Alex couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over him since finding the photograph. He tucked it into his pocket, feeling a strange compulsion to hold on to it, as if it contained some answer he was still trying to piece together. The image of the dark figure lingered in his mind, and with each passing hour, the store seemed to grow colder, quieter, as though it were holding its breath. He returned to the front counter, his eyes drifting to the security monitor, half expecting to see the figure reappear. The aisles on the screen looked empty, save for a few scattered displays, but something felt wrong. The shadows seemed darker, thicker, pooling in the corners of the store in a way that made his skin crawl. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the silence was oppressive, pressing down on him with a weight that made each breath feel heavier. Around 3 a.m., he heard it again, the faint tapping sound, this time coming from aisle 7. He stood there, frozen, the sound echoing softly through the store, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone, or something, knocking on the shelves. He clenched his fists, the photograph crinkling slightly in his pocket, and forced himself to move toward the sound, each step echoing in the heavy silence. When he reached aisle 7, he found it empty, the shelves lined with cereal boxes and canned goods, everything in its place. But as he turned to leave, he saw a faint figure standing at the far end of the aisle, barely visible in the dim light. The figure didn't move, its gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. He blinked, and the figure vanished, leaving only the silence and his own racing heartbeat. Alex stumbled back, his hand reaching instinctively for the photograph in his pocket. He pulled it out, his gaze drawn to the shadowy figure in the image. It was the same presence he'd seen in the aisle, watching him from the darkness, its face hidden, its intentions unreadable. He felt a wave of nausea, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of it all. Why was this happening? What did the figure want? He took a step back, the photograph slipping from his hand and landing face up on the floor. Just as he bent down to retrieve it, the lights flickered again, plunging the store into darkness. His heart pounded as he felt his way back to the counter, the silence now filled with a low, faint whispering, like voices murmuring just out of reach. He held his breath, listening, but he couldn't make out the words. All he could feel was the oppressive presence of the store closing in around him, the darkness stretching out, alive with something he couldn't see. As the lights came back on, the whispering stopped, leaving him alone once again. He glanced around, his gaze landing on the photograph. The figure in the image seemed to have moved, shifted slightly closer to the foreground, its shadow extending as though reaching out to him. He backed away, every instinct telling him to leave, to lock up and never look back. But he knew that whatever haunted Cutter's Market wasn't going to let him go that easily. Alex felt trapped, every exit from Cutter's Market seeming as distant as the dawn. The photograph haunted him, the figure's dark silhouette embedded in his mind. He glanced at the clock, 3:33 a.m. Only a few hours remained of his shift, yet time seemed to crawl, each second stretching into eternity as the store settled into an unnatural quiet. He took a shaky breath, the silence pressing in as he forced himself to keep moving, desperate to distract himself from the fear gnawing at his nerves. He walked down aisle 7 again, eyes scanning the shelves, searching for some clue or sign. But everything looked as it should, each item neatly in place, the shelves orderly and untouched. As he turned the corner, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass doors of the freezer section. But his reflection wasn't alone. Behind him, just over his shoulder, was the shadowed figure, its face still obscured, watching him with a chilling, silent intensity. He whipped around, but the aisle was empty, the stillness of the store undisturbed. His heart pounded as he turned back to the glass, half expecting the figure to reappear. But it was gone, leaving only his own pale reflection staring back at him. He clenched his fists, anger mixing with his fear. He couldn't keep running from shadows. Whatever haunted Cutter's Market was toying with him, drawing him in, and he was done playing its game. Determined, he made his way to the back room, searching through the storage shelves until he found an old box labeled, "Store History." He tore it open, sifting through dusty papers and faded photographs until he found what he was looking for, an old article from the town's newspaper, dated from decades ago. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance at Cutter's Market." He skimmed the article, his hands trembling as he read about a former night shift worker who had vanished without a trace, last seen in the early hours of the morning. The article mentioned sightings of a strange figure, one seen lurking in the aisles at night, a presence that had plagued the store long before Alex's time. His stomach turned as he realized that this wasn't just his imagination. The figure was real, a ghost or a memory imprinted on the store, a shadow that refused to leave. And now it had him in its sights. Just as he finished reading, the lights flickered again, the room plunging into darkness. A chill swept over him, and he heard it, the faint whispering, louder now, filling the air around him, a chorus of voices layered over one another, indistinct yet pleading. He felt the weight of countless eyes watching him, their presence thick and suffocating, as though the very walls of the store were alive. He stumbled back, his hand brushing against something cold and solid. He turned, his flashlight illuminating the familiar figure now standing directly in front of him, its shadow stretching across the floor. The figure's face was still obscured, but its hand reached out, gesturing toward the photograph Alex held. His breath caught, a terrible understanding settling over him. This figure, this presence, wanted something from him, a memory, a witness, someone who would remember its story. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex spoke into the darkness. "I see you. I know what happened to you," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure paused, the whispering voices fading into silence, as though acknowledging his words. And in that moment, the air lightened, the darkness receding as the oppressive weight lifted. The figure began to dissolve, its form fading into a thin mist that slowly dissipated into the air, leaving Alex standing alone in the empty room. As he walked back to the front of the store, he felt a sense of closure, as though the presence that had haunted Cutter's Market had finally found peace. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly morning, his shift almost over. The store was quiet once more, but he knew it would never feel the same. Cutter's Market held secrets, and now he was a part of them, forever bound to the night he'd spent among the shadows. When Sarah Dawson first saw the old house on Rook Hill Road, she felt a strange pull, a sense that the place was calling to her in some inexplicable way. She'd been looking for a quiet escape from city life, a place where she could work on her novel in peace, away from the constant noise and demands of modern life. And there it was, a Victorian-era house, standing alone at the end of a winding road, shrouded by thick oaks and the constant murmur of the wind. It was old and a little warm, but something about it felt like home. The realtor, a woman named Joan, seemed eager to close the deal. "It's a quiet place," she'd said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Perfect for someone like you." Sarah noticed the hesitation in Joan's voice but brushed it off as small-town gossip. Old houses often carried strange stories, but that only added to the charm in Sarah's mind. Besides, she was a writer, she wasn't afraid of a few ghost stories. After moving in, she quickly settled into a routine. The first few days passed quietly, and Sarah found herself enjoying the solitude. The creaks and groans of the old house became familiar, almost comforting, as if the place were adjusting to her presence. She would sit by the large bay window in the evenings, watching the light fade over the hills, feeling as though the house was wrapping itself around her, like an old friend welcoming her into its embrace. One evening, as she was unpacking boxes in the basement, she found something unusual. It was an old, worn journal tucked between the wall and a wooden beam. The cover was dusty, its pages yellowed with age. Curious, Sarah flipped through the entries, her fingers brushing over faded ink that told the story of a woman named Margaret. The entries were short, but they painted a picture of a lonely life, filled with whispers and strange occurrences in the house. Margaret's words grew increasingly frantic as the pages went on, each entry laced with fear and isolation. "It won't let me leave," read one entry, the handwriting jagged and hurried. Sarah shivered, brushing it off as the ramblings of a woman who had likely lived too long in solitude. But a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret had experienced something real, something that lingered within the house long after her time. That night, Sarah had trouble sleeping. She kept hearing faint noises, whispers that seemed to drift through the hallways, the sound of footsteps echoing in the silence. She told herself it was just the wind, the natural settling of an old house, but there was an unsettling quality to the sounds that she couldn't ignore. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the house breathe around her, each creak and groan resonating in her chest like a heartbeat. In the morning, she brushed off the strange night, telling herself it was just nerves. But as she walked through the house, she noticed something odd. The journal she'd left in the basement was sitting on the kitchen counter, open to the same page she'd read last night. Her heart pounded as she read the words again, feeling as though Margaret was trying to tell her something. And in that moment, Sarah realized that the house on Rook Hill Road was more than just old, it was alive, and it had no intention of letting her leave. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finding the journal on the kitchen counter had left her rattled, but she tried to brush it off as forgetfulness, telling herself she must have brought it up without realizing. But as the days passed, the house's strange behavior became impossible to ignore. Every night, the whispers grew louder, faint murmurs drifting through the walls, too soft to make out but too persistent to ignore. One evening, while reading in the living room, she heard footsteps creaking across the ceiling above her. She froze, her heart pounding, listening as the sound moved down the hallway and stopped right above where she sat. Slowly, she looked up, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the ceiling stared back at her, silent and still. She held her breath, waiting, but the footsteps faded into the silence, leaving her alone with the pounding of her heart. Curiosity soon got the best of her. She grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the second floor, following the direction of the footsteps. The hallway was dimly lit, its wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. She moved cautiously, her flashlight casting long shadows against the walls as she walked. At the end of the hallway, she found an old wooden door, slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. She pushed the door open, stepping into a small, dusty room that appeared to be a study. A heavy, antique desk stood by the window, and a stack of books lay scattered on the floor, covered in a fine layer of dust. But it was what was on the desk that caught her attention, a photograph, yellowed and curled at the edges, of a woman staring blankly into the camera, her eyes hollow, her expression haunted. Sarah's stomach twisted as she picked up the photograph, feeling a chill run down her spine. The woman looked familiar, her features matching the description she'd read in the journal. Margaret, the previous resident of the house. She turned the photograph over and saw a faded inscription written on the back, "Rook Hill has its secrets. Don't trust what you hear." Sarah swallowed hard, the words echoing in her mind as she looked around the room, feeling as though Margaret's ghost was watching her, guiding her to uncover something hidden. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder this time, their tone more urgent, almost pleading. She strained to make out the words, but they were jumbled, overlapping one another in a language she couldn't understand. She tossed and turned, the voices filling her ears, pressing in on her from all sides, until finally, she drifted into a restless sleep. In her dreams, she saw Margaret, standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with terror. Margaret reached out, her lips moving soundlessly, as though trying to warn Sarah of something. When Sarah woke, she felt a crushing weight in her chest, an overwhelming sense of dread that lingered long after the dream faded. She realized that Margaret had been trying to communicate with her, to show her something that only she could see. The following day, Sarah went back to the little study, determined to find answers. She searched through the desk drawers, finding old letters, bills, but nothing that explained the strange occurrences in the house. Then, at the back of the bottom drawer, she found a small key, rusted and tarnished with age. She held it in her hand, feeling its cold weight, and knew, deep down, that it was the key to uncovering Rook Hill's secrets. Whatever lay hidden in the house wanted to be found, and it wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. Sarah spent the next day exploring every corner of the house, the rusted key clutched in her hand. She tried it on every door and cabinet she could find, but nothing fit. It was as if the key had been left there just to taunt her, a reminder of the secrets Rook Hill was hiding. The whispers grew louder that night, filling the halls with fragmented words and strange, soft sighs that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. She could no longer dismiss them as her imagination, the house was trying to tell her something, and she was determined to listen. Late that evening, she returned to the study, hoping to find some clue she might have missed. As she entered, she noticed a small trapdoor tucked beneath the heavy desk, barely visible in the shadows. Her pulse quickened. She knelt, the old floorboards creaking under her weight, and tugged at the trapdoor's metal ring, struggling as it resisted, almost as if it didn't want to be opened. Finally, it gave way, revealing a narrow passage leading into darkness. Taking a deep breath, Sarah switched on her flashlight and descended, the narrow staircase groaning under her weight. The air was thick, musty, laced with an ancient smell of decay. The passage led her to a small, windowless room lined with shelves of old books and dusty artifacts. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and in the center of the room was a large wooden chest, its surface scarred and worn. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she slid the key into the lock. The chest opened with a creak, revealing its contents, a collection of letters, yellowed with age, and a small, ornate box wrapped in a piece of faded lace. She picked up the box, running her fingers over the intricate carvings that adorned its surface, feeling the rough, cold texture under her fingertips. She opened it, revealing a collection of strange trinkets, a locket, a small vial filled with a dark liquid, and a delicate ring with a single, cracked stone. Each item seemed to radiate a strange energy, as though they were relics from a life long forgotten. Among the letters, she found one addressed to whoever finds this, written in Margaret's shaky handwriting. Sarah unfolded it carefully, her hands trembling as she read. "If you found this, then the house has chosen you too. I don't know why it does this, but I know it won't stop. I've tried to leave, but every time I do, I end up back here, trapped. The house has its own way of holding you, keeping you close. There's something buried within these walls, a secret it doesn't want to let go. Be careful. Don't trust what you see or hear." A chill washed over her as she read the letter, Margaret's words settling into her mind like a curse. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, each creak of the floorboards, each whisper in the shadows, binding her tighter. She understood now that leaving wouldn't be easy. The house had claimed her, and it wasn't about to let her go. As she returned upstairs, the air grew colder, the walls seeming to pulse with a faint, ominous energy. The whispers returned, louder than before, filling her ears with frantic, overlapping voices. She ran to her bedroom, slamming the door shut, but the sounds followed her, seeping through the walls, growing more insistent with each passing second. She clutched Margaret's letter, her knuckles white, feeling as though the house was closing in around her, drawing her into its depths. That night, her dreams were filled with visions of Margaret, her pale face twisted in anguish, her hollow eyes pleading for release. Sarah woke in a cold sweat, her heart racing, and knew that she had to find a way to break the hold the house had on her. But as she looked around her room, the walls seeming to press closer, she realized that Rook Hill was not just a house. It was alive, and it had chosen her as its next captive. Sarah knew she couldn't stay in the house much longer. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow shifting in the corners, felt like a reminder that Rook Hill was tightening its grip on her. Armed with Margaret's warning and the strange relics from the hidden chest, she was determined to find a way out, to break whatever curse bound her to this place. But deep down, she feared that she was already too late, that, like Margaret, she was trapped, claimed by the house's insidious power. She spent the next day researching everything she could find on the history of Rook Hill Road, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might explain the house's strange hold on her. At the local library, buried within the archives, she found an article from the late 1800s about the house's original owner, a man named Edmund Keene, who had mysteriously disappeared after rumors of dark rituals and strange happenings within the house. Locals had whispered that Edmund had been searching for immortality, that he delved into forbidden knowledge, hoping to bind his spirit to the house itself. As she read, Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. It was clear now that Edmund's influence still lingered in the walls, his presence bound to Rook Hill, feeding on those drawn to the house. She was just the latest in a long line of captives, and each whisper, each strange occurrence, was a manifestation of his desperate hold on the place. She realized then that Edmund's spirit was not simply lingering, it was trapped, feeding on the living energy of those who entered, clinging to the house in a twisted version of his quest for immortality. With renewed determination, Sarah returned to the house, clutching the relics she'd found in the chest. She was certain they held the key to breaking the house's hold, that they were artifacts connected to Edmund's life and legacy, symbols of his failed attempt to conquer death. She arranged them on the old desk in the study, each piece feeling heavy with purpose, as though it carried a fragment of Edmund's soul. As night fell, the house grew colder, the shadows lengthening as the whispers began anew, filling the air with a low, insistent murmur. She took a deep breath, her hands steady as she placed Margaret's letter beside the relics, hoping that acknowledging the spirits who had been bound to the house might weaken Edmund's control. The air grew thick, the walls seeming to close in as she spoke aloud, her voice trembling. "I know who you are, Edmund. I know what you did here. It's time to let go." The room fell silent, the whispers halting as though the house itself were holding its breath. For a moment, everything was still, and Sarah felt a flicker of hope that she'd broken the curse, that Edmund's spirit had finally been laid to rest. But then, from the shadows, she felt a cold, invisible hand wrap around her wrist, holding her in place, the air filled with a soft, mocking laugh that seemed to echo from the walls. The lights flickered, and she saw him, a faint, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the room, his face twisted in a cruel, satisfied smile. She realized then that Edmund's hold was stronger than she'd thought, that he wasn't simply haunting the house. He was part of it, woven into its foundation, feeding on the fear and despair of those who wandered into his trap. With a surge of defiance, Sarah tore her hand free, grabbing the relics and throwing them onto the floor. The laughter stopped, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that shook the room. She could feel the house shudder, its foundations trembling as though Edmund's spirit were unraveling, his grip loosening with each passing second. She ran for the door, feeling the walls press in around her, the whispers turning to anguished wails as she burst outside, gasping for breath. As she looked back, she saw Rook Hill silhouetted against the moonlight, its dark windows watching her, silent and still. She knew the house would never truly release its hold, that Edmund's spirit would linger, waiting for the next soul to fall into his trap. But she was free, and as she walked away, she felt a strange sense of peace, knowing she'd broken the cycle, if only for a while. Mr. Ray Harper had driven bus number 17 for the Clover Valley School District for nearly 20 years. He was a man of routine, a stickler for punctuality and order, with a soft spot for his young passengers and the quiet rhythm of his daily routes. But there was one route he hated, the late shift, a final run he only had to make once in a blue moon. It was the last ride of the night, picking up straggling students who'd missed their buses after late activities. Tonight was one of those rare nights, and as he pulled the bus into the empty school parking lot, a strange chill crept down his spine. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lot as he sat behind the wheel, drumming his fingers on the dashboard, waiting. The clock ticked slowly past 8 p.m., and he wondered why the kids hadn't shown up yet. He was certain the schedule said 8:05, but as the minutes crept by, his unease grew. Finally, just when he was about to radio in and check, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. A line of students, heads down, slowly filing out of the darkened school building. "Let's go, folks," he called out, waving them onto the bus. But the kids were quiet, their faces hidden in shadow as they boarded in single file, their footsteps eerily silent against the metal steps. Mr. Harper frowned but brushed it off as nerves. The late shift always made him uneasy, the emptiness of the town, the silence of the roads. It was a far cry from the bustling, loud routes he was used to during the day. As he pulled out of the lot, he glanced at his rearview mirror, noting the kids scattered across the seats, all staring straight ahead. They seemed older somehow, different from the usual elementary kids he drove. They were too still, each of them watching him with an intensity that made him shiver. "All right, let's get you all home," he muttered, gripping the wheel tightly as he headed down the familiar route, the trees lining the road casting shadows that danced in the flickering headlights. A few miles in, the bus hit a rough patch of road, jolting everyone. Mr. Harper looked up, ready to apologize for the bump, but stopped short. In the mirror, he saw the students staring back at him, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes dark and hollow. He blinked, his breath catching in his throat, but when he looked again, they appeared normal, just tired kids on a late-night ride. He shook his head, laughing at himself. "Getting jumpy in my old age," he muttered, his voice sounding hollow in the empty silence. As the bus approached the old bridge, his radio crackled, static filling the cab. He reached over, twisting the dial, but the static only grew louder, a low, garbled noise that grated on his nerves. Suddenly, a voice broke through, faint and distorted. "Turn back," it whispered, barely audible, sending a chill down his spine. He glanced in the mirror, expecting the kids to notice, but they sat still, unblinking, as though they hadn't heard a thing. Ignoring the strange warning, Mr. Harper pressed on, determined to finish the route. But as he crossed the bridge, a heavy fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, obscuring the road. He slowed the bus, his heart pounding as the fog pressed in on all sides, leaving him alone in a sea of white. And as the eerie silence deepened, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer driving alone, that something else was on this bus, watching, waiting for him to take them to a place he had never intended to go. Mr. Harper's grip tightened on the steering wheel as the fog thickened, wrapping around the bus like a shroud. He could barely see the road, and the headlights seemed swallowed by the mist, casting only a faint glow ahead. His heart hammered in his chest, and every instinct screamed for him to stop, to turn back. But with each passing mile, he felt an invisible pull, an urge that kept him moving forward, deeper into the fog. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he noticed something odd. The kids were sitting in the same positions, staring forward as though in a trance. A strange chill crept down his spine as he realized none of them had moved since they'd boarded. They sat unnaturally still, their faces blank, their eyes hollow, unseeing. Swallowing his fear, he called out, "All right, kids, just a few more minutes, then I'll get you home." His voice echoed in the silence, but none of the children responded. They remained frozen, as though they hadn't heard him at all. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something, a flash of movement outside the bus, barely visible through the fog. His pulse quickened as he squinted, trying to make out the figure, but it vanished into the mist as quickly as it had appeared. He turned his attention back to the road, fighting the urge to slam on the brakes and abandon the route altogether. But as he glanced at the clock, he realized that time itself seemed to be slipping away. The hands hadn't moved since he left the school parking lot, stuck at 8:07, as though they were suspended in some unnatural limbo. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life again, filling the cab with a soft, distorted hum. He reached for the volume, hoping for some explanation, some message from dispatch. But instead, a low, mournful voice whispered through the static, echoing in the silence, "You shouldn't be here." The voice sent a shiver down his spine, and for a moment, he felt paralyzed, unable to move as the words echoed in his ears. When he glanced back in the mirror, the children were no longer looking forward. They were staring at him, their hollow eyes fixed on his reflection, unblinking. Heart pounding, he forced himself to focus on the road, fighting the urge to look back. The fog began to thin, revealing an old, unfamiliar road lined with twisted trees. The branches arched over the road like skeletal fingers, casting dark, jagged shadows that seemed to reach out, trying to pull the bus into their grasp. Mr. Harper didn't recognize this part of the route, he was certain he'd never driven down this road before. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, drawn along a path he couldn't escape. As they moved deeper into the trees, he saw them, shadowy figures standing on either side of the road, barely visible in the darkness. They watched the bus with empty, hollow eyes, their faces twisted in expressions of sorrow and longing. He felt a wave of fear and pity, an overwhelming sense that these figures were trapped, bound to the road as surely as he was now bound to the wheel. One by one, they raised their hands, reaching out as the bus passed, their fingers brushing against the windows, leaving faint, ghostly prints on the glass. He knew he had to get out, to turn the bus around before it was too late. But as he pressed the brake, the pedal went soft beneath his foot, unresponsive. The bus continued forward, ignoring his commands, the engine humming with an eerie, unnatural life. And as the fog closed in around them once more, he realized the truth: the bus was no longer under his control, taking them on a journey neither he nor his passengers had intended to take. Mr. Harper's mind raced as he struggled to regain control of the bus. The brake pedal was useless, and no amount of steering seemed to alter their course. They were barreling forward down the twisted, fog-shrouded road, and the bus seemed to have a will of its own, pulling them deeper into the dark. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, heart pounding as he took in the students behind him. They stared back at him, their eyes dull, empty, and fixed on him as if expecting him to know what to do. He forced himself to call out, his voice cracking under the strain. "Kids, if you can hear me, hold on. We'll figure this out." But the silence that followed was chilling. None of them blinked or moved, as if frozen in place, bound to the seats by some unseen force. He watched as their faces seemed to pale, their expressions growing more vacant by the second, and a wave of fear washed over him, colder than the fog that surrounded them. Then, out of nowhere, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls of the bus. It grew louder, rising into a deep, mournful wail that seemed to echo off the trees lining the road. The sound seemed to seep into his bones, filling him with a sense of dread so intense that he could barely keep his hands steady on the wheel. And as the wailing grew louder, he saw it, a bridge looming ahead, ancient and crumbling, stretching over a dark, rushing river. Instinctively, he braced himself, gripping the wheel as the bus urged forward. They crossed the bridge, the metal creaking under the weight of the vehicle, the boards beneath them groaning in protest. Just as they reached the middle of the bridge, he felt the entire structure shudder, as though it were ready to give way. But the bus pressed on, determined, as if guided by an invisible hand, finally reaching the other side and plunging back into the dense fog on the opposite bank. Once across, Mr. Harper felt a strange, heavy silence settle over them. The road ahead was even darker now, the trees closing in tightly on either side. The air grew thick with a musty smell, damp and decaying, and he could feel the weight of countless unseen eyes watching them from the shadows. Every instinct told him to turn back, to abandon the bus and flee. But he knew he couldn't leave the kids, not while they were under his care, whatever they had become. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a figure standing in the middle of the road, directly in their path. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, her face twisted in an expression of grief and anger. Her eyes locked onto his, hollow and accusing, as though she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him. He gritted his teeth, his hands trembling on the wheel, but he couldn't stop the bus. It drove straight through her, the figure dissolving into a mist that seeped into the bus, filling the air with the scent of earth and decay. The wailing began again, softer this time, as if echoing from within the very walls of the bus. He glanced in the mirror and felt a shiver run down his spine. The children's faces had changed, they looked older now, their eyes hollow and sunken, their expressions twisted in sorrow and regret. It was as though they were slipping away, fading into shadows, becoming part of the strange journey that had bound them all together. He realized then that this wasn't just a bus ride. This was a passage, a journey into a place he didn't understand, where the living and the dead crossed paths, their stories intertwining in a haunting dance of memory and sorrow. And as he pressed on, helpless to stop or turn back, he knew one thing with chilling certainty: this was the last ride he would ever take. Mr. Harper's hands were numb on the steering wheel, his mind a whirl of terror and confusion. Every instinct screamed for him to abandon the bus, to flee this nightmare. But something held him there, something stronger than fear, a sense of duty, of responsibility for the students who sat eerily still, their faces pale and gaunt, barely resembling the kids he had picked up at Clover Valley. They were changing, fading, and as he looked at them in the rearview mirror, he knew he was too. The fog outside grew thicker, pressing against the windows, heavy and suffocating. And then he saw it, a faint glow ahead, flickering like a beacon in the darkness. The road curved sharply, leading them toward a place that shouldn't exist, a small clearing where an old, crumbling house stood, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of time. The bus rolled to a stop on its own, as though it had reached its final destination. The silence was thick, oppressive, and Mr. Harper's heart thundered in his chest as he waited, unsure of what would happen next. Slowly, one by one, the children rose from their seats, moving in unison, their expressions blank and distant. They walked down the aisle, passing him without a glance, their steps soundless as they descended the stairs and filed out into the clearing. He watched, frozen, as they approached the house, their forms flickering in the faint glow like shadows in a dream. They stopped at the door, standing in a silent line, waiting. Unable to bear the sight any longer, Mr. Harper stumbled out of the bus, following them with shaking steps. He felt a strange pull, a compulsion to approach the house, as if he were being summoned. The children stood motionless, staring at the door, their faces illuminated by the soft, unnatural glow that seemed to emanate from within the walls. As he drew closer, he noticed carvings on the door, symbols and words in a language he couldn't understand, ancient and foreboding. Suddenly, the door creaked open, revealing only darkness within. The children began to enter, one by one, disappearing into the shadows without a sound. Mr. Harper's mind screamed for him to turn back, to run, but his feet carried him forward, driven by a force he couldn't resist. He stepped across the threshold, the darkness swallowing him, and immediately felt a suffocating weight pressing down on him, a chill that seeped into his bones. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and earth, the walls lined with faded photographs, faces of people he didn't recognize, their eyes filled with sorrow and fear. And then he saw them, the children, standing in a circle in the center of the room, their faces turned toward him, their expressions hauntingly empty. He felt a tremor of fear as their eyes fixed on him, and he understood, with a chilling certainty, that he had become part of something much older, something that bound the living and the dead in an endless, inescapable loop. The wailing began again, a mournful sound that seemed to echo from the very walls. Mr. Harper took a step back, but the children moved forward, their hands reaching out, their eyes pleading. They weren't just passengers, they were lost souls, trapped in this place, bound to the road, the bus, to him. And now, he was one of them, caught in a cycle he could never escape, a ghost driving a ghostly bus, destined to ferry the lost across the threshold of the unknown. As he looked into their eyes, he felt the last of his fear slip away, replaced by a strange calm, an acceptance of his fate. He knew now that this was his purpose, his final duty, to drive the last ride, over and over, until the end of time. And as he stepped back onto the bus, the fog closed in around them, the children's faces fading into the shadows, waiting for the next night, the next lost souls who would join them on the endless journey into darkness. Earl Landry had been the watchman of Oakwood Cemetery for nearly 30 years. He was a quiet man, never one to stir trouble or share his business with anyone. He found comfort in the stillness of the graveyard, the way the tombstones cast long shadows at dusk, the familiar creak of the iron gate that opened onto the overgrown path. It wasn't the kind of life he'd dreamed of as a boy, but it was a life he'd grown accustomed to, and one he found a strange kind of peace in. On most nights, Earl would make his rounds just as the sun dipped below the horizon, walking the rows of graves with a heavy flashlight and a thermos of coffee. The graves were old, some dating back to the early 1800s, their inscriptions faded and worn. He knew each name, each epitaph, by heart, their stories etched into his mind as clearly as the lines on his own weathered face. To him, Oakwood Cemetery wasn't just a burial ground, it was a place of memory, of stories long forgotten by everyone but him. But lately, things had felt different. There was an uneasy energy in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was subtle at first, the sense of being watched, a cold breeze even on the warmest nights, shadows that seemed to stretch a little too far. He brushed it off as superstition, reminding himself that he'd spent decades in the graveyard without ever encountering anything that couldn't be explained. Still, the feeling gnawed at him, a whisper at the back of his mind that grew louder each night. One evening, as he made his way to the old chapel at the far end of the cemetery, he noticed something unusual. A fresh bouquet of lilies lay on the doorstep, their petals gleaming white in the moonlight. It wasn't unusual for mourners to leave flowers at graves, but the chapel was off-limits to the public, and he hadn't seen anyone enter that night. He bent down to pick up the bouquet, but as his fingers brushed the petals, a shiver ran down his spine, the flowers icy cold against his skin. He tried to ignore it, placing the flowers on the ground and continuing his rounds. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, a quiet presence lurking just beyond the edge of the light. He turned, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there, only the rows of silent graves, stretching out before him. He muttered to himself, blaming his nerves, but his heart raced as he hurried back to his small cabin at the edge of the cemetery. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Earl lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building, the occasional rustle of leaves outside his window. He'd been alone for years, yet tonight, the solitude felt different, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. Just as he began to drift off, a sound jolted him awake, a faint, rhythmic tapping on his window. He sat up, his breath catching in his throat as he listened. The tapping grew louder, steady and insistent, like fingers drumming against the glass. Gathering his courage, he reached for his flashlight, shining it toward the window. But as he looked, the tapping stopped, and he saw nothing but his own reflection staring back at him, his eyes wide and filled with fear. And in that moment, he knew that whatever was haunting Oakwood Cemetery had taken an interest in him. The tapping faded into an unsettling silence, leaving Earl's heart pounding in his chest. He lay back down, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the night in his mind. The flowers, the eerie presence, the tapping on the window, it all felt connected, weaving together a tapestry of unease that wrapped tightly around him. Despite his years of guarding the cemetery, he'd never felt this vulnerable, this exposed to whatever was lurking in the shadows. The next day, Earl decided to investigate the source of his growing anxiety. He donned his worn flannel shirt and work boots, grabbing his flashlight and making his way toward the chapel again. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He reached the chapel's door and found the lilies still lying there, their vibrant color stark against the weathered wood. They had not been disturbed. With a cautious glance around, he picked up the flowers and stepped inside. The chapel was dim, the air heavy with the scent of aged wood and dust. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. He walked to the altar, a sense of reverence washing over him, and placed the lilies there, feeling strangely compelled to honor whoever had left them. As he examined the chapel, he noticed a small wooden box in the corner, half hidden by a tattered old curtain. Curiosity piqued, he approached it and pulled back the fabric. The box was intricately carved, its surface marked with symbols that looked ancient and worn. It was locked, but the craftsmanship was beautiful, and he felt an overwhelming desire to know what lay inside. He took a step back, a frown creasing his forehead. Why would something like this be tucked away in a forgotten corner of the chapel? Suddenly, the air grew cold, a chill that prickled at his skin and sent goosebumps racing down his arms. Earl turned sharply, scanning the room for any signs of movement, but the chapel remained still. The feeling of being watched crept back in, heavier this time, and he felt a shudder of apprehension deep in his gut. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he instinctively backed away from the box, unwilling to linger in the oppressive atmosphere. That evening, as twilight descended and the shadows grew longer, Earl returned to the graveyard, the box weighing heavily on his mind. He had an overwhelming urge to open it, to uncover its secrets, yet he hesitated, acutely aware of the unsettling energy surrounding the cemetery. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that something dark lingered just out of sight. As he made his rounds, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the growing darkness. It was a woman, her back turned to him, her hair flowing down her back like a dark waterfall. Earl's breath caught in his throat. He knew everyone who frequented the cemetery, and this woman was unfamiliar. She seemed to be staring at the grave of someone he recognized, her posture rigid and mournful. "Excuse me," he called out, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in his voice. The woman didn't respond, she remained motionless, as if caught in a moment frozen in time. Earl's heart raced, and he took a cautious step toward her, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. "Can I help you?" Just as he was about to reach her, she turned slowly, revealing a face pale and drawn, her eyes dark and hollow. The world around him faded, the sounds of the cemetery quieting as she spoke in a soft, echoing voice. "You need to leave this place," she said, her words hanging heavy in the air. "It's not safe for you here." Earl froze, the weight of her gaze penetrating deep into his soul. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She seemed to float closer, a whisper of a smile on her lips that did nothing to reassure him. "I am a watcher, like you," she replied cryptically. "But I have seen what lurks in the shadows, and I know the price of ignorance." With that, she turned and walked back into the darkness, leaving Earl standing alone at the edge of the graveyard, heart racing, mind swirling with questions. What had he stumbled into? And what dangers awaited him in the depths of Oakwood Cemetery? Earl stood frozen, the echoes of the woman's words ringing in his ears. "It's not safe for you here." The weight of her warning settled heavily on his chest, and he felt a surge of anxiety. He had always thought of himself as a guardian of the cemetery, someone who kept the peace between the living and the dead. But now, he was beginning to wonder if he was simply a pawn in a game much larger than himself. He walked back to his cabin, the path through the graveyard feeling longer and more daunting than usual. Shadows flickered among the tombstones, whispering secrets he couldn't decipher. His hands shook slightly as he unlocked the door, the familiar creak of the hinges sounding like a warning. Once inside, he locked the door behind him and sank into a chair, staring out at the darkening grounds. His mind raced with thoughts of the mysterious woman and the dark figure he had glimpsed. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not just by the living but by the spirits that lingered among the graves. The photograph in the chapel flashed through his mind, the gaunt woman's face staring back at him. He wondered if she was connected to the graveyard, if she too had once been a watchman, trapped in this endless cycle of duty and despair. As the hours crept on, he poured himself a cup of coffee, hoping to calm his nerves. But the familiar comfort of the warm brew did little to ease the chill that clung to him. He glanced at the clock, noticing it had barely moved since he'd arrived home. It was as if time itself had come to a standstill. Outside, he could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the whispers growing louder, intertwining with his thoughts and amplifying his fears. Feeling restless, Earl grabbed the old journal he kept in the cabin, flipping through its pages for something, anything, that might explain the peculiar occurrences he'd been experiencing. He paused at an entry discussing the lore of the graveyard, tales of restless spirits and dark rituals performed long ago. One particular passage caught his eye: "Beware the shadows that linger. They are not always what they seem." His heart raced at the implications of the words. Had he unwittingly disturbed something in the graveyard? The thought gnawed at him, and as he leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washed over him. He was drawn to the window, his eyes scanning the grounds for any sign of movement. Just as he was about to turn away, he caught a glimpse of something, an apparition flickering at the edge of the trees, too quick for him to focus on. He squinted, trying to make out the figure, but it vanished into the darkness. Earl stood, adrenaline surging through him. He knew he had to confront whatever was haunting the graveyard, but part of him was terrified of what he might find. As he stepped outside, the chill in the air felt more pronounced, and the whispers intensified, swirling around him like a tempest of voices. "Show yourself," he called out, his voice echoing through the cemetery. He felt foolish, demanding the unseen to reveal itself, but desperation propelled him forward. The fog clung to the ground, swirling at his feet as he stepped onto the path toward the old oak tree at the center of the cemetery, a place he'd always avoided due to its eerie reputation. When he reached the oak, he noticed a small, half-buried stone at its base, worn and moss-covered. Kneeling down, he brushed away the dirt to reveal a name etched into the surface: Margaret Keene. The name sent a shiver down his spine. Was she the woman he'd seen? He recalled the faded photograph in the chapel, the woman's face matching that of the spirit who had warned him. As he stood, a sudden gust of wind rushed past him, the air growing colder, the whispers rising into a crescendo. Earl felt a presence envelop him, as if the shadows had taken form. He turned slowly, eyes darting around, but all he could see was the darkened cemetery, the shadows pooling like dark pools of water. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her, Margaret, standing just beyond the tree line, her expression somber, her eyes filled with an urgent intensity. "Help us," she whispered, her voice carried by the wind, echoing through the graveyard. Earl's heart pounded as he realized the shadows had drawn him in, and the spirit of Margaret was beckoning him toward a truth he could no longer ignore. Earl felt an irresistible pull toward Margaret, the ghostly figure standing just beyond the oak tree. Her presence radiated an urgency, a deep, desperate need that resonated within him. The shadows seemed to shift around her, swirling like a dark mist, and as he took a cautious step forward, he felt the weight of the graveyard pressing down on him. "What do you need?" he called out, his voice shaky but determined. Margaret's expression softened, but there was still a flicker of anguish in her eyes. "The watchman must know," she replied, her voice trembling, barely more than a whisper. "The darkness that lingers here, it's not just the past. It's a curse that binds us all." Her form flickered in and out, the shadows around her blending seamlessly with the night. Earl knew he had to act, to understand what she meant, but fear gripped him, rooting him to the spot. "Why me?" he asked, his voice barely carrying above the rustle of the leaves. "Why are you coming to me?" He felt the shadows shift behind him, the cemetery alive with whispers that seemed to echo his thoughts, taunting him with the weight of his own fears. "Because you see us," she replied, stepping closer, the fog swirling around her legs. You're not like the others. You can help us break the cycle." The sincerity in her voice sent a jolt through him, igniting a flicker of hope. He had spent his life as a guardian of this place, and though he felt small and insignificant, he realized that he had the power to listen, to fight against the darkness that had taken root. Suddenly, the shadows around them thickened, closing in as if responding to their conversation. Earl could hear the distant echoes of laughter, cries, and sorrowful whispers filling the air, a cacophony of voices rising in a haunting crescendo. It was overwhelming, but he pressed on, steeling himself against the encroaching darkness. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his resolve hardening. Margaret gestured to the old oak, its gnarled branches stretching toward the night sky. "There lies the key," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You must uncover the truth that binds us. The watchman's burden is heavy, but only by confronting it can you set us free." The urgency in her tone resonated deep within him, and he felt an almost magnetic pull toward the tree. With a deep breath, Earl stepped toward the oak, reaching out to the rough bark. As he pressed his palm against the trunk, he felt a surge of energy ripple through him, visions flooding his mind. He saw glimpses of the past, mourners weeping at graves, laughter shared under the tree's branches, and shadows whispering secrets that lingered like dust motes in the air. And at the heart of it all, he felt the pain of the lost souls, trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape. As the visions subsided, he stumbled back, breathless. "What happened here?" he gasped, the weight of history settling heavily upon his shoulders. "What can I do to help?" He turned back to Margaret, who stood watching him with a mixture of hope and sorrow. "There is a grave," she whispered urgently. "One that has been forgotten. You must find it." And with that, she began to fade, her figure dissolving into the mist, leaving behind only the soft sound of her voice. "Remember, you are the watchman now. Only you can end our suffering." Earl watched as the fog enveloped her completely, his heart racing as he processed her words. He was now charged with a mission, a purpose that transcended his role as a mere caretaker. With newfound determination, he looked around the graveyard, searching for any signs of the forgotten grave. The weight of the past pressed upon him, but he knew he could not falter. The time for action had come, and the souls of Oakwood Cemetery were depending on him. Earl stood at the foot of the oak tree, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the mist, illuminating the graveyard around him. The whispers had quieted, but the air still thrummed with energy, and he could feel the urgency in Margaret's words echoing through him. He needed to find the forgotten grave, the one that held the key to ending the suffering of the lost souls. The question was, where to begin? He walked slowly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, scanning the rows of tombstones for anything out of the ordinary. The gravestones were old, some nearly illegible, their inscriptions worn away by time. But as he moved deeper into the cemetery, he began to notice something peculiar. The ground was uneven in certain places, mounds that looked unnatural, as if something lay buried beneath the surface. The chill in the air grew thicker as he approached a cluster of these mounds, his instincts telling him that one of them might hold the answers he sought. He knelt beside the nearest grave, brushing aside the grass to reveal the headstone beneath. It was cracked and worn, but as he wiped away the dirt, he could make out a name, Elizabeth Keene. The name sent a shiver down his spine, the connection to Margaret suddenly clearer. He stood, heart racing, and looked around, feeling a pull toward the next grave in the cluster. He could feel it, the weight of something buried here, a truth that needed to be unearthed. As he knelt beside another mound, he found a smaller stone, half buried and covered in moss. He dug around it carefully, unearthing a name he never expected to see, Samuel Keene. Samuel, he murmured, piecing together the history of the family that had once lived and died within the shadows of the cemetery. He couldn't shake the feeling that these two, Margaret and Samuel, were tied together, their fates intertwined in a way that had yet to reveal itself. Just then, a gust of wind swept through the cemetery, and he felt a strange energy radiating from the graves. It was as if the spirits were awakening, urging him on. He began to dig, using his hands to scrape away the earth around Samuel's grave, adrenaline pumping as he unearthed layer after layer of soil. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him in an ethereal chorus, beckoning him to uncover the truth. After several minutes of frantic digging, he finally reached the coffin, its lid aged and rotting. With a deep breath, he pried it open, the wood creaking in protest. As the lid fell away, a wave of cold air rushed out, and Earl stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, he found not just bones but a collection of items, old letters, a locket, and at the center, a small book bound in cracked leather. He reached in and pulled out the book, its pages fragile and yellowed. He could feel the weight of history in his hands, a connection to the past that surged through him as he opened it. The first pages were filled with Margaret's elegant handwriting, recounting the lives of the Keene family, their hopes, their dreams, but also the shadows that lurked in their lives. As he read on, the letters revealed a dark truth. Samuel had been experimenting with dark rituals, searching for a way to extend life, to bind himself to the land. But something had gone wrong, and in his desperation, he had inadvertently trapped Margaret and himself in a cycle of misery. The final entries were frantic, detailing their pleas for freedom, their struggles against the shadows that surrounded them. The last entry sent chills down his spine. If anyone finds this, do not let our fate be your own. You must destroy the oak that binds us, or we shall remain forever. The realization hit him hard. The oak tree, the very thing he had felt drawn to, was the key to their liberation. Earl felt a mix of terror and resolve as he understood what he must do next. With the weight of the journal clutched tightly in his hand, Earl stumbled back from Samuel's grave, the implications of what he had discovered flooding his mind. The oak tree was not just a tree, it was a vessel, a living connection to the spirits of the Keene family, a symbol of their binding to this land. He could no longer ignore the whispers that had filled the air around him, nor the growing urgency that drove him toward the tree. The time had come to confront the source of their torment. He rushed back to the old oak, the moonlight glistening off the leaves like scattered stars. Each step felt heavy, the ground beneath him pulsing with energy as he approached the massive trunk. The air grew thicker, and he could hear the whispers rising around him, merging into a single voice that seemed to cry out for release. Earl paused for a moment, feeling the gravity of the moment pressing down on him. He reached out, placing his hand against the rough bark of the tree, and immediately felt a surge of energy pulse through him. It was like an electric shock, sending waves of pain and clarity coursing through his veins. In that moment, he understood the tree's history, its roots entwined with the souls of those it had trapped, the very essence of their sorrow feeding its growth. With each breath, he could feel their anguish, their desperate cries for freedom echoing through time. Earl stepped back, drawing in a deep breath. "I'm here to set you free," he declared, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "I will break this curse." He could feel the spirits responding to his words, a collective energy rising around him, urging him on. He knew what he had to do. The journal had hinted at a way to sever the connection, to release the spirits bound to the tree. He took a few steps back and grabbed the shovel he had left behind near the grave. With the weight of the tool in his hands, he felt a surge of determination. He began to dig, his heart racing with each shovelful of dirt that flew behind him. As the hole grew deeper, he could feel the presence of the oak tree intensifying, its roots twisting and turning as if sensing the disruption. The whispers around him grew louder, transforming into a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some angry. "Stop! Don't!" they cried, echoing in the wind, but Earl pressed on, fueled by the desperation of the Keene family, and the desire to free them from their torment. He dug deeper, sweat trickling down his forehead, the air thickening with the scent of damp earth. Finally, as he struck something solid, the whispers shifted, growing frantic. Earl's heart raced as he uncovered a thick, gnarled root entwined beneath the surface. It was blackened and twisted, pulsating with a dark energy that felt almost alive. He realized this root was the very lifeline of the tree, the conduit through which Samuel's dark power flowed. Earl raised the shovel high above his head, feeling the weight of history bearing down on him. "You're not going to hold anyone captive anymore," he shouted, his voice rising above the din of the angry spirits. With a fierce determination, he brought the shovel down, striking the root with all his strength. The moment the blade met the wood, a shockwave rippled through the air, and the ground trembled beneath him. The whispers turned to screams, a terrible chorus of despair and fury as the roots cracked and splintered, releasing a dark mist that spiraled into the night sky. Earl fell back, shielding his eyes from the blast of energy as the dark tendrils of the tree recoiled, writhing like snakes in agony. The air was filled with a sound that was almost musical, a release of pain and sorrow that had been trapped for too long. As the dark mist began to dissipate, he felt the presence of the spirits lifting, their anguish fading into the cool night air. He rose, slowly, the weight of the shovel feeling lighter in his hands as he stepped back, watching the oak tree shudder and sway, its branches trembling in the wake of the release. The fog that had enveloped the cemetery began to clear, revealing the stars shining brightly above. In that moment, he understood that he had done more than just sever a root, he had freed the spirits of the Keene family from their eternal bondage. The darkness that had filled Oakwood Cemetery for so long was lifting, and he felt a warmth enveloping him, a gentle caress of gratitude from those who had once been lost. As the dark mist faded into the night, Earl stood in awe of what he had just done. The air around him felt lighter, the whispers that had filled his ears silenced by the release of the spirits. The oak tree, once a towering symbol of sorrow and despair, seemed to breathe anew, its leaves rustling gently in the evening breeze. For the first time in years, he felt a profound peace settle over Oakwood Cemetery. The moon hung high in the sky, illuminating the graves with a silver glow. He glanced around, half expecting to see the specters of the Keene family standing before him, but they were gone, their presence lifted like a fog in the dawn. Instead, the cemetery felt alive, vibrant with the energy of the past finally set free. The weight of the years had been lifted from his shoulders, and he realized that he was no longer merely a watchman, he was a liberator. Earl took a deep breath, savoring the crisp air that felt almost electric. As he walked back toward his cabin, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The loneliness that had once enveloped him now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a connection to the spirits who had once haunted him. He had become a part of their story, a chapter in their lives that would not be forgotten. When he reached his cabin, he found the journal still open on the table, the pages fluttering slightly as if stirred by an unseen breeze. He picked it up, his fingers tracing over the letters Margaret had penned so long ago. "You need to leave this place," she had warned. In that moment, he understood what she had meant, not just for himself, but for all those bound to the graveyard. He would carry their stories with him, ensuring they were remembered, not lost to time. With a sense of finality, he made his way to the window, looking out at the cemetery bathed in moonlight. The shadows that had once clung to the gravestones were receding, and the air was filled with the gentle sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves, the soft sigh of the wind. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the watch he had kept, for the darkness he had confronted, and for the peace he had restored. Just then, the church bell in the distance chimed midnight, its resonant tones echoing through the stillness of the night. Earl felt a sense of closure wash over him, a quiet promise that the past would be honored and the future would be bright. He knew that he would return to the graveyard, not as a watchman burdened by the weight of the dead, but as a friend to the spirits who would forever remain a part of him. And so, as he sat by the window, he allowed himself to drift into a deep, peaceful sleep, the sounds of the cemetery lulling him into dreams filled with whispers of the past, stories of love, loss, and redemption. Earl Landry had embraced his role not just as a guardian, but as a keeper of memories, a conduit for the lost. Oakwood Cemetery was no longer just a place of sorrow, it was a sanctuary, a testament to the power of release, and a reminder that even in death, there is life, and in every ending, a new beginning. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out our channel for more stories.